Halliburton or any other company, we certainly would.
But there was no lack of evidence that Halliburton opposed the U.S. embargo. CEO Dick Cheney went to Calgary to tell oil men it was costing them money.
Sometimes government can get in the way of sound policy. An example of the ineffectiveness of government mandates are U.S. unilateral economic sanctions.
To find out how Cheney and Halliburton got around that problem, you've got to come to a tax haven like the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean. Here's why the Cayman Islands are important to Halliburton. The U.S. embargo against Iran has a loophole, a big one. It is illegal for American companies and American citizens to trade with Iran. But if an American company is registered offshore and has no American employees, it can trade with anyone it wants. During Dick Cheney's time as CEO, Halliburton had dozens of those foreign subsidiaries, including one in the Cayman Islands that, interestingly enough, dealt exclusively with Iran. Halliburton's address in the Caymans is at this bank, but there's no office here and no employees, just a mailbox. The bank manager says the company's mail gets rerouted to Houston, Texas, Halliburton's head office.
This is designed to deceive, and that's what we see. It's what we've seen in Halliburton in so many ways.
One of Halliburton's and Cheney's foremost critics in Washington is Democratic Senator Frank Lautenberg. He says any business with Iran is illegal, unethical, or both.
We are at a virtual confrontation level with Iran almost at every moment. And to be looking for breaks in the law that permit them to profit while this hostility is in front of us is unacceptable under any condition.
And it wasn't just Iran. The year Cheney took over Halliburton, the company was fined almost $4 million for selling products that could be used as nuclear triggers to Libya. And while he was CEO, Halliburton's subsidiaries did more than $70 million worth of business in Iraq, at least some of which, experts agree, would have gone right into the pockets of Saddam Hussein. But when Cheney went back to Washington as vice president, those old business partners became the axis of evil. As for Abdul Amir Mahdi, sometime during his 4 years behind bars, he wrote Dick Cheney a letter. What did you say to Mr. Cheney?
Very simple sentence. If I'm guilty, you're guilty. If you're innocent, I'm innocent. You did business with the same country I did.
He's a thorough man.
When we return, Mr. Cheney goes back to Washington. And America goes back to war. It was spring of the year 2000. The last U.S. presidential campaign was in full swing, and Texas Governor George W. Bush had wrapped up the Republican nomination.
We get to send a signal that we're sick and tired of Clinton Gore in Washington, D.C.
He needed a running mate. The Bush family asked an old friend, his father's defense secretary, Halliburton CEO Dick Cheney, to lead the search for the best man. It didn't take long for Cheney to find him.
I'm proud to announce that Dick Cheney, a man of great integrity, sound judgment, and experience, is my choice to be the next Vice President of the United States.
Mr. Cheney, how do you feel about being picked, sir? Pretty good.
Dick Cheney's relationship with George W. Bush has been characterized in many ways: as the president's mentor, his minder, as the man who's really in charge.
Not me.
What Cheney and those close to him also brought to the White House was an absolute belief that the 21st century would belong to America, and that it would start with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Saddam is ousted. You get rid of the top leadership, you get a moderate Ba'athist regime, and a democracy flows out of like water out of a fountain. And not only will democracy flow in Iraq, it'll flow into Syria. Syria will see the light. The Iranians will see the light.
Seymour Hersh is one of America's foremost investigative journalists. He says even before 9/11, Dick Cheney was insistent the U.S. must invade Iraq and begin changing the world.
Just go in, it's going to roll over. They believe this. They believe this. Utopian, idealist, crazy.
Dick Cheney's moment arrived with those jetliners on September 11th. His plan was now on the fast track. Bin Laden and al-Qaeda would know the wrath of the U.S., but so would Saddam and Iraq.
I don't think it's available to us to sit back and say, please just be polite filling station attendants, pump the oil for our SUVs, and leave us alone.
Former CIA Director James Woolsey, now a Pentagon advisor, still supports Cheney and his argument for a preemptive attack on Saddam.
A fundamental change in Iraq in which one destroyed Saddam's ability to work with terrorist groups in other countries, destroyed his ability, however far along they were or were not, to have programs and chemical, bacteriological, nuclear weapons. And that will have a huge effect, not just by example, but a huge effect on the Middle East as a whole.
After September 11th, as after the invasion of Kuwait a decade earlier, it was Dick Cheney's job to sell a war against Iraq.
We all have to recognize as a nation that 9/11 changed a great deal in our lives.
We know that Saddam Hussein had the intent to arm his regime with weapons of mass destruction.
We do know with absolute certainty that he is using his procurement system to acquire the equipment he needs in order to enrich uranium to build a nuclear weapon.
According to Seymour Hersh, selling that nuclear threat was crucial for Cheney to convince Americans to support the war.
With that case, they could not only win the public, but they could win the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate. You have to understand, without that case, I don't think they could have gotten the authority.
The problem was that though the Central Intelligence Agency had been tasked to find evidence of Saddam's WMDs, especially nuclear weapons, that's not what the best information showed. Dick Cheney visited CIA headquarters. Not once, the record shows, but 8 separate times. He's said to have wanted to see more forward-leaning intelligence on Iraq.
Analysts get the drift. They get the drift. They write reports critical, they go nowhere. They write a report that supports the White House. All of a sudden, they're giving briefings at the White House. Come on. Everybody gets the drift.
About the same time, the Pentagon established a secretive group to work closely with the Vice President on intelligence matters. It was known as the OSP, the Office of Special Plans.
Their starting point was not, let's try to figure out what was going on, but let's see what kind of information we can come up with to justify the policy line that we wish to pursue.
Greg Thielman was an intelligence specialist with the State Department who watched the emergence of the OSP. It soon became clear to him what its mission was and who was behind it.
Cheney was the driving force behind an orchestrated presentation to the American public of a different version of reality than at least the reality that we saw.
In the intelligence business, that's called cherry picking, selecting individual morsels of information that support a certain view.